podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Love Tennis Podcast, where I'm very glad to say we are back to our full complement. Well, I say I'm glad. George is back. Make of that what you will. I'm James Gray of iNews.co.uk and the iNewspaper. As I say, I'm joined by George Belshaw, tennis writer, former proper tennis writer, now just a part-timer as far as I can tell, and also tennis coach Calvin Betton, who is anything but a part-timer. Although, actually, mostly these days, Calvin, it sounds like you're a sort of glorified cabbie from all the complaints about the traffic and the roadworks. Just tell me about your driving today.
Well, for anyone who doesn't know, there's currently 4 tournaments in a row at Nottingham, 4 25Ks, where the players I coach playing. And Nottingham kind of just falls within the time it takes to travel for me to not be able to justify staying over. It takes about an hour and 20 from where I live normally. And today, I live in Barnsley, and today it took me 3.5 hours to get home because there was a bomb scare at the Barnsley Junction. Somebody had left a suspicious object on a footbridge.
My suggestion is that the suspicious object was something like an iPhone, but in Yorkshire, I imagine that's pretty high tech. So
I thought you were going to say a piece of soap or something like that.
No, that would be much more classist and hugely problematic. George, no bomb scares at your place. I mean, I think the scariest thing that happens to you is trying to get up to go to the loo, isn't it?
My mobility's okay. It's quite painful after having holes drilled into you and stuff.
Turns out surgery's quite painful.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm kind of weaning myself off the meds now, but I've also just been pretty forgetful a lot of the time and just not really that functional. So I've watched a fair amount of tennis this week, I believe, but we'll see how much I actually remember.
Okay, we'll maybe park the quiz for this week. We have got loads to talk about this week. We're going to, of course, talk about that man, Carlos Alcaraz. We never need a second invitation. A bit about Novak Djokovic and Rafael Nadal and how we rate their various comebacks. Ons Jabeur winning a title in Madrid as well. We'll also talk a bit about scheduling because everyone else has been. Barbora Krejcikova, still haven't seen much of her. Naomi Osaka, another injury concern. Kevin Anderson's retired. Gilles Simon is also said he's retiring. Marion Vida is back. Calvin's got something to say about heavy tennis rackets and something about Sonay Kartal as well. We'll try and get through everything if we can. I apologise if we don't. As always, I have to thank anyone who's left us a 5-star review in the last couple of weeks. Anna Mayo in Ireland says, great insights into tennis, both technical and recent news. Thank you very much, Anna, for that one. Mini Tennis, who I think I may have read last week, but it bears repeating, says, loves listening to this podcast. There's often a different take on some tennis pros and coaches, which I really appreciate because it differs from the popular views. We are nothing if not different. I'll agree with that. Terry from New Zealand says, this is the only tennis podcast I listen to. James, Calvin and James. I assume you mean James, Calvin and George, but I'll take it. I'll be very flattered.
That's how forgettable I am.
Weekly update on the major tennis stories. Great banter. It's the first podcast to listen to when it comes out. Long may the pod continue. Thank you, Terry, all the way in New Zealand. And then 1 or 2, in fact, from very recently indeed. A great podcast. Good to see James's podcasting ability is better than his skills at the poker table. From Alan 987653221. Thanks, Alan. You're not wrong. And then finally, from FD9278, I assume he was christened that. Very informative and witty tennis podcast, covers all aspects, funny and serious, on and off the court. One member is a tennis coach and has technical insights too. Very enjoyable. Well, maybe if you didn't hear my intro, you can try and guess which one of us is the tennis coach as the show goes on. George, I don't know whether I want to start with what you've rather sort of ominously labelled George's mysterious Federer and Djokovic flashback in Madrid. Maybe this is a good way for new listeners to get to know the weird and wonderful way your mind works. Tell us about Djokovic and Federer in Madrid.
Well, as I mentioned before, I've had a lot of time to sit around and think this week. And obviously this week was the Madrid Open, and I was I was watching one of Djokovic's matches, and I had kind of probably a bit slightly painkiller induced, a few kind of flashbacks. And I thought I'd share with you a story I remembered from, I think it was the 2019 Madrid Open. I don't think I've told anyone before because I used to keep little tidbits like this under my hat for a
Love
rainy
tennis
day.
exclusive here.
Love tennis
Big.
exclusive. But I thought it was quite funny. I thought you might enjoy it. So it was 2019. I'd gone into the player lounge to interview Belinda Bencic. So at the time, I was doing a series of WTA columns where I'd kind of ghostwrite for the players for Metro. And we were kind of hanging around after that. I was waiting to be escorted back to kind of, where the lowly media sit.
The safe zone.
And Roger Federer is playing on the TV in the player lounge, and he's playing Gael Monfils. And I don't know if you remember this match, but it was pretty tight, and Federer saved a couple of match points at the end, so it was all pretty dramatic. So I'm stood there in the play around watching this with a couple of other people because it's kind of right at the climax. I think it finished in a tie break, like a third set decisive tie break. And who comes to watch it but Novak Djokovic? So Djokovic is kind of stood next to me, watching the match, getting quite into it, and it becomes quite apparent he's supporting Monfils quite heavily. So I'm kind of sat there watching it, getting quite into it, and he's incredibly animated. I couldn't quite believe how kind of openly willing he was to kind of back against one of his greatest rivals. Anyway, needless to say, Monfils lost the match. And he had a bit of a howler on one of the match points, I think, or had a chance to really set it up. And Djokovic, just before even seeing the conclusion of the match, throws his hands up in the air, yells something in Serbian, which I can only assume was, "Oh, for God's sake, Gael, why didn't you finish him?" And storms off. So that was my amusing Madrid tidbit. But the final part of it that I thought was also quite funny was then...
There's a punchline.
A couple of weeks later, we were sat in a press conference with Djokovic, and he was about to face one of, I think, possibly Federer or Nadal, or had the prospect of, and then he was asked, do you prefer your rivals to go out early or not, or do you rather meet them? Well, I always want to face my rivals. It's the greatest challenge in the history of sport. I'm thinking, I've just seen this bloke 2 weeks ago swearing his head off in Serbian about Federer coming through. So there you go. That's my little story that I've had time to think about this week.
There you go. The weird and wonderful ways of the George Belshaw mind. Let's get on to more serious things. Less weird, less wonderful. Well, more wonderful, quite frankly. King Alcaraz of Madrid. Carlos Alcaraz, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, both of you, that might be the greatest Masters 1000 title ever. There are very few people who have ever beaten Djokovic and Nadal to win a Masters title. To do so in back-to-back matches as a teenager in only about his fifth Masters tournament, full stop. Not to mention the pressure of a home crowd. Quite remarkable. It's only a shame that the final against Alexander Zverev was a complete mismatch. Zverev says he got to bed at 5 o'clock in the morning that night. We'll discuss exactly why and how a little bit later on. But Alcaraz triumphed 6-3, 6-1. He only just got past the hour mark to do so. It was pretty much a non-event. George, the greatest run to a Masters final ever?
Good question. I feel like David Nalbandian probably holds that record.
Yeah.
I think he beat Federer, Djokovic, Nadal, Del Potro, and possibly Burdick in the same tournament.
I mean, that does seem absolutely insane. He did beat all the big three in a row, which is pretty remarkable.
But yeah, I mean, this one was right up there. I think I read it was the first man to beat Djokovic and Nadal on clay in the same tournament, which sounds, unbelievable, really. But
in consecutive days, it was.
Is it in consecutive days?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he was sensational, Alcaraz. I mean, he was playing some wonderful stuff. There's always a little bit of a caveat, I suppose, in terms of where Nadal and Djokovic were both out in those matches. But I thought he handled the big moments really well. There were ups and downs in both matches, times where I thought Alcaraz was going to go away, and he just kind of really stuck in there, kept going, and ultimately got the win. So, yeah, I was pretty impressed by him.
Which of the three matches, Cal? I mean, okay, you can talk about any of the five, but I'm assuming that straight sets win over Nicholas Basilashvili isn't going to figure much in your rankings. Which of the three, or albeit the two really, because the final was a non-event, which of those two victories do you find more impressive?
Djokovic, I think, because Nadal, we still don't really know where he is on fitness terms, and he's not the same force on the clay of Madrid as he is anywhere else. And on top of that, we've already seen Alcaraz and Nadal. Seen it twice this year already, or once?
Mm-hmm. Twice, I think.
Yeah, twice already this year. So we kind of knew where we were at on that, but we didn't know how he'd fare against Djokovic. And yeah, not a 100% version of Djokovic, but we're getting there, getting pretty close to it. So I also thought he was all over Djokovic. There was a period in the third set where when he had the lead, I think he had the lead on serve, albeit, but I thought the only way that Djokovic is getting back in this is if Alcaraz starts missing, because he didn't have any other way of winning the match from that point, and Alcaraz didn't miss enough.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, there were times where Alcaraz was kind of playing one of those matches where you're thinking, wow, this is just someone who can hit through Novak and absolutely like batter him off the court, like a Wawrinka or team, when those guys are at their hottest, it's kind of unstoppable. I felt the first two sets, I actually thought Djokovic was the better player, really. At the start, Alcaraz came out firing and Djokovic was quite slow. But Djokovic kind of felt quite comfortable on serve and kept like he was pressuring Alcaraz a lot of the way. To be honest, I also felt he probably should have won in straight sets, Djokovic, and this is where one of my caveats kind of sits in this match. It's that I think a super sharp Djokovic finishes that match off. He had a couple of kind of break points that then would have let him kind of serve for the match about around the 5-all mark in the second set, where Alcaraz did really, really well. I think, he hit a drop shot into the net, and then on the following point, he then went for the drop shot again, and it worked, and he kind of beat Djokovic. But in the build-up to that second drop shot, felt Djokovic was a little bit passive to me, where I don't think peak Djokovic necessarily would have been. I think he would have been a little bit more dominant in that point and kind of more willing to go for it. So, yeah, I was really, really impressed by Alcaraz's maturity and ability to hang in. But I think my feeling was a fully fit, firing Novak Djokovic, who potentially will peak in Paris, and we'll see that version of Djokovic would have had this sewn up in straight sets.
Can anyone, and I suspect George knows the answer to this because I think he was there, can anyone tell me the last person to beat Novak Djokovic at Madrid before Carlos Alcaraz?
Was it Federer?
Wasn't Federer. Not convinced Federer's ever beaten Djokovic in Madrid. In fact, he hasn't. George?
Tsitsipas, was it?
No, it wasn't Tsitsipas. It was our very own Kyle Edmund.
Oh, Kyle Edmund.
Gosh, yeah.
In 2018, beat him in the second round in 3 sets. You were there, were you?
I was there, yeah.
I think we'll blame
I just assumed he'd lost more recently.
We'll blame your newfound drug addiction for that one, maybe.
2018, the lost year, wasn't it, for Djokovic? The tree hugging years.
I mean, I don't think there's only 1 year of that. But let's not get into Novak Djokovic's weird and wonderful ways quite yet. The final, I mean, does anyone not buy that Zverev was knackered because he got to bed at 5 o'clock the night before and didn't perform for that reason and that reason alone, George?
I mean, to be fair to Zverev, he did kind of say, I probably still would have lost this match, but it would have been closer and a better match. I can kind of buy into that. I mean, to be honest, even when Alcaraz had beaten Djokovic, I still had Zverev as the slight favourite for this match. I thought,
which is reasonable. He's a 3-time Madrid champion,
Yeah, I just felt his serve would be potentially too much if he played that shot well. Obviously, he didn't, so he was never going to win that match without serving really, really well and without being dominant. it's a hard one. I know we'll go into the scheduling a little bit later and kind of the issues that came with that. But, I've also seen people this week praising him for practicing his serve at 1:45 in the morning or whatever after a match. So I'm not really sure he hasn't kind of caused a lot of his own problems from that perspective. If you're that worried about getting to bed late, stop serving straight after the match and practice in the morning like a sensible person. But
yeah, for people who aren't aware, Zverev's semi-final against Stefanos Tsitsipas finished after midnight in Madrid on Saturday night. He then went straight to the practice court and started hitting serves. From your perspective, Calvin, I don't know if you've ever had a player whose match has finished that late. Have you ever had one then say, "I'd like to go and hit some serves, please"?
I've never finished that late. I can't think. Maybe sort of midnight-ish would be. I played till midnight.
There's nothing. There's no way in hell. Even if a player said to you, "I really want to go and hit some serves," surely you'd say, "Actually, mate, the final's tomorrow. Like, we should probably go to bed."
No, I also think I don't really see the value in it because there's nothing. At that time, what are you going to do? You're going to hit 2 or 3 serves and convince yourself it's all great, or you're going to hit 2 or 3 serves that are not great, and then you're going to dig that mental hole even deeper than what it previously was. So at that time, it's not like you're going to start a workshop on the serve and start correcting technical changes. You wouldn't do that in a tournament anyway. So anything that would be done there, you could do the next morning. I do wonder sometimes whether there's a bit of it's all for show, this thing of it's kind of for social media, and it achieved its goal in that regard, didn't it? People were talking about how Zverev was out practicing serves at 2 a.m.
It always strikes me as that kind of cliche. He's the first and last out of training in football. It's like, well, if you actually train well and properly, you don't need to be there first and last. Like train effectively.
Well, that's also not true with Zverev. Like one of the reasons that Ferrero stopped working with him is because he never turns up for practice on time and he couldn't stand it. So, I look, I think, and you both know, I don't like to give Alexander Zverev any sympathy or any credit for anything really, given everything else that's going on in his life. But he's not had an easy time of it. His father has been very ill. His father would usually be in the box and hasn't been this week. I believe he's going to be back with him in Rome. But that's obviously very difficult. And, to try and acknowledge some of his humanity, that's a difficult thing to go through. I mean, we've seen countless players who are used to having their parents in their box completely go to pieces when they're not able to be there. I mean, I think particularly of Amanda Anisimova, and she obviously tragically lost her father, who was her coach, a couple of years ago, and it massively affected her game. So I'm sure when that's all going through your head, it's difficult at the best of times. But nevertheless, I was really disappointed by Zverev in the final. It did make me laugh afterwards when he said, I was so tired, I couldn't hit my serve. I missed 2 overheads that were so simple, I just could barely keep my eyes open. And I was like, mate, don't kid yourself. You'd have missed those overheads if you'd had 13 hours sleep and hadn't played in 2 days. Honestly, there were some classic Zverev moments. The second serve started coming back and the big double faults. And I think actually match point, he ended up at the net and hit a volley into the bottom of it. So to a certain extent, this is Alexander Zverev. I suppose what impressed me the most about Alcaraz was this was the first time really that he wasn't any sort of underdog. Against Nadal, the crowd had been for Nadal, obviously. They had acknowledged Alcaraz's points when he won them, but the rules are far bigger when Nadal had won them. So he was both the underdog on the court and off it, if you like. Semi-final against Djokovic, the crowd were with him. Of course they were. But he was still the underdog because he was playing probably the greatest player of all time. When he got to the final, he was the favourite, but I think by most people's measures, and he was, of course, the crowd favourite. So all of a sudden, that dynamic is completely flipped, and he seemed to not be bothered by it. He seemed to play with such freedom, and there was no... The first service game, maybe, he shanked a forehand, and I think he might have missed a second serve. But really, there was nothing really there.
The thing with Alcaraz that's probably just different to all the other guys who've come up recently is I'm really struggling to kind of think of a player I think Alcaraz will struggle against. Like, what is the profile of player that beats this guy? Like, you think about the kind of range of the top guys on tour, like someone like Medvedev. Calvin did a really good kind of breakdown of Sinner's game, for example, and he was talking about how someone like Medvedev might cause Sinner problems because he's so far back and hit through. Alcaraz can not only hit through people, but he's got one of the best drop shots I've ever seen. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. Like, I think he hit something like 8 drop shots against Djokovic and won 7 of the 8 points. That's a really high success rate against one of the fastest guys on tour. And
I think he was 85%. 85% of success. That's tournament wide, which is a completely insane number.
He's not using them at like obviously sensible times either. He can just disguise from the baseline really well mid rally, which I think kind of makes that percentage even higher. Like, when you see guys go for that, like a Kyrgios or Fognini, who probably is normally the profile you'd think try kind of outrageous drop shots at random times, they're going to have a pretty mixed success rate on that, I imagine. So for him to keep that level up that high with, and
you see Nadal do it, and he's not very good at it, but he doesn't need to be, because guys end up being so deep behind the baseline against him just to try and deal with it. You're talking about the profile of player to beat Alcaraz, George. I mean, I'm just looking at the people who have beaten him in 2022, and there aren't many of them. Matteo Berrettini at the Australian Open. But the Berrettini
that was tight. That was a coin flip match.
Well, it was a 5th set tiebreak. Yeah, I think you can't really take much. And Alcaraz actually did win quite a lot more points in that match, weirdly. Nadal beat him Indian Wells. It's Nadal. He's one of the greatest players ever. He was still fit then. The Korda match in Monte Carlo, I think basically right off, like it was his first match on clay of the season. It was incredibly windy. It wasn't a good match. You just can't take that away. The one I would look at, and I'm not going to say that he's going to beat him ever again, possibly, but Alex de Minaur pushed Alcaraz very, very hard in Barcelona. They, I think, had 2 tiebreaks, and Alcaraz won the 3rd set 6-4. And, he was able to run down the drop shot a reasonable amount. He obviously doesn't have the power to compete, but someone who can stick with him physically, that's like, I think that's probably your baseline, like absolutely must. I don't see someone like a Riley Opelka I don't see any of the serve bots really challenging him, for example.
Yeah, I mean, the Divinor one just strikes me as like quite a weird match being that close, because Alcaraz is so ridiculously quick and so much more ridiculously powerful and got better shots in his locker than Divinor that you kind of expect him that I'd expect him to match up quite poorly against him in many ways, Divinor. But yeah, I mean, look, it's interesting you say the serve bots there. I don't know his record against guys like Isner or Opelka. I've not seen him play them, but maybe that is the sort of Achilles heel of Alcaraz when he starts playing these guys. Who knows? That's possibly, I'm going to say wishful thinking. I don't want him to lose matches. I want him to be really, really great, but I'm kind of just trying to find a chink in this guy's armor at the minute, because mentally, physically, shot selection, shot range, this guy's got everything, which is quite a scary prospect for the rest of the tour, I think.
I mean, so basically the thing is, and Calvin will agree with me on this, all the data we have on Alcaraz, you basically write off anything that happened before the last US Open, because everything before that, he's a different bloke as far as I can tell. So just looking at those matches alone, of the big servers, he really hasn't played very many. Just almost by coincidence, he played He played Berrettini, and he beat him on clay in Rio de Janeiro, and then he lost to him in 5 sets. Before which he had lost to him in 5 sets in Australia. But other than that, he hasn't played Opelka this year. He hasn't played Isner this year. So maybe that's the one.
So what we're basically saying is this guy's a total fraud until he beats Isner, Query, Ryan, Opelka. He's rubbish. I'm not having any of it.
Oh, I'd say he beat Marin Cilic. I know that doesn't necessarily.
He doesn't count. He doesn't count as.
Does he not get into the Servbot Club? No?
Not these days. Oh,
okay. Calvin.
I think, I guess the one who we don't know is Medvedev, who has the big serve. He's not a bigger server as Isner and Opelka, but his serve is huge, and he brings a completely different dynamic. As we've said previously on here, he's a completely unique player in history, really, as to what he brings. This kind of 6'6" guy who's got a big serve but never misses a ball and hits to a perfect length every time. I'm not saying that he will have Alcaraz's number. It's just a type of player that we don't know yet where he stands against that tactically. I was thinking as I was watching it, actually, it's funny, isn't it, how you always talk about players in generations and what will the next generation bring. And he's almost market corrected the whole of that next generation. Like the whole landscape changes now. Like I remember, like we were having a debate not so long ago about whether, I think George said he thought Sinner would get to world number one about a year ago. There's no chance Sinner becomes world number one now. Not with, I mean, not with, yeah, I don't think Sinner, I think he's leveled off a bit as Sinner anyway. He'll still be a very good player, but he's never going to be a better player than Alcaraz. Like that's just not going to happen. But even players like Tsitsipas, who I would have had Tsitsipas down as a kind of 8 or 9 major guy. I don't think he's doing that now. Like Alcaraz could clean up.
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, like the number of majors I've had in my head for people like Zverev is always like, I was thinking, no one's going to dominate this next generation. He could kick around somewhere between 2 and 6, and I wouldn't be particularly surprised. Now I'm like, ooh, Zverev might not win a slam, which could be really good news for me personally. But is it too early to say? Who knows?
I've always thought the two I've had question marks about who previously you would have thought were nailed on. You'd have put your mortgage on the winning slams as Felix Auger-Aliassime and Zverev, and I'm not convinced that either of them will win one, and that's not just down to Alcaraz.
I think Zverev, he is young enough. He's only 25. He's got a game that will probably last quite well. I think he'll win an Australian or a US Open at some point. You
say that though, James, but I know a physio and a strength and conditioning coach told me about 2 years ago that in terms of robustness for longevity, Zverev has the worst body type. In terms of, you look at him, he's quite tall, isn't he, and not very big.
He's quite almost bow-legged. Like, yeah, he looks a bit like that lanky kid at school. I imagine George was one of those. He just
well, I've just had surgery.
Yeah, exactly.
He may go and look. Anything can happen in tennis. He may go and win one or something like that. But I don't think Zverev's winning. I'd be hugely surprised if Zverev ends up with 3 or 4 or more Grand Slams.
To flip the question on its head, then. I mean, obviously we can't predict injuries and form, and who knows, there might be someone 2 years younger than Alcaraz who's going to be even better. What's the number of slams we're looking at now? Are we looking at a guy who's going to pass the others for 20? Because he does seem suddenly head and shoulders above the rest, and younger with greater potential. I mean,
logically, I think I still think 10, and 10 is still a huge amount. It's more than Agassi, McEnroe, Lendl, any of those guys, but he looks so much better than everyone else in that generation has ever looked. Like, when we've looked at players before and we sort of thought this guy looks a serious prospect for the future, and we're talking about Felix Auger-Aliassime making a semi-final or something, or Sinner Sinner winning the next gen. And this guy's like 19 and he's already won 2 Masters series.
The thing I wonder about us saying 10 is really good, which it is, I'm not saying it's not really good. I just feel like the goalposts, we don't know to what extent like the goalposts have been shifted for new generations now with the old guys. Like if you think about kind of Federer, Nadal, Djokovic going for, say, that original 14 of Sampras, which none of them would have been like, oh, I'm definitely going to get to that number. But they actually, like, a lot of them racked up a lot of the wins quite a lot later and then had these kind of targets to aim for. Yeah. Alcaraz is kind of young enough, maybe not have the opposition these guys have with that number already in mind. Does that make it easier knowing that people have already done it? Does it make it less surmountable?
Absolutely, 100%. Absolutely 100%. It makes it easier when someone's already done it. Like, you can only dream what you can dream. Like, I think it's virtually impossible, really, for Federer starting out to say, I'm going to win 20 slams, because it's 6 more than any man has ever won.
And then, like, you're thinking, well, Federer, Djokovic, and Nadal have split 60 between them. Why can't I win all 60 if I've not got a Nadal or Djokovic alongside me? But you know what I mean? Like,
Can you imagine it?
if you start
60
slams, I'm backing it right now. 60 slam Alcaraz.
I tell you what, I was thinking today we might be the sort of hype deflation merchants, you know, in our classic mould as podcasters who, you know, zag when other people zig and, you know, say the different things and are prepared to have different opinions. But no, we are fully on board with the Carlos Alcaraz hype train.
For what it's worth, James, I'll zag 1 second. He won't win the French Open. That's my zag.
That's not a zag.
That's a zag. That means he's only getting to 59.
I'm just wondering, in the 60 slams that he's winning, where are we factoring in Holger Rune's 12 French?
It's a cat among the pigeons, Holger Rune.
But look, a couple of things that, you know, tennis is strange. If you'd have said in September of 2020 that Dominic Thiem would never win another slam, people would think you were crazy. And I think that's very, very, very likely now that he won't win another one. But we're talking about, I think somebody said last week, how Tsitsipas and Alcaraz could be one of the great rivalries. There's no rivalry in there. Alcaraz has got Tsitsipas's number. Like that's never going to be a rivalry. I'm certain of that. Maybe if they play on a fast hard court or grass once Tsitsipas figures out grass, but not for me.
For what it's worth, just nipping back to matchups, seeing as you've brought up Thiem, I mean, that is a match I would be interested to see, a fully fit Thiem on clay against Alcaraz. I think that would be a pretty good match. And, you know, for all Calvin saying we don't think Thiem will get back there, I thought Thiem, he lost, by the way. It's a funny need today. But
yes,
I thought, again, there were real strides of improvement on that forehand, on the serve. The backhand is still working. I don't think it's actually out
against Murray.
No, Fognini today.
Oh, I didn't realize he played today. Right.
Yeah, he played today. He lost, so it's still. I'm not still saying it.
Okay.
It was suddenly perfect, but it was just another step forward that I felt was actually quite encouraging. So I'm not ruling Thiem out of another slam. And I think that'd be potentially a very, very good match, because that's someone with a weapon who could harm Alcaraz, but we'll have to wait and see.
So that's Alcaraz down to 58 now, because Thiem's got to win one. He's running out of Grand Slams, this lad. I mean,
46. There's all Rune's French Open.
Yeah. Crikey, yeah. Really
probably let Medvedev's got to have one more, doesn't he?
45? 45,
45.
Honestly, we're running out of Grand Slams for Carlos Alcaraz. I apologise for not derailing the Carlos Alcaraz hype train, but I suppose we're allowed to get excited every now and again. Just before the break, Novak Djokovic, good week or bad week in a sentence, George?
Good week, going to peak for French Open, and will win it, if not Nadal.
Right. Calvin, good week for Novak Djokovic in a sentence?
Yeah, very good week, I think.
That's a very short sentence, even better. And same question, Rafael Nadal. Where do you think he is in terms of, if you were to give him a rating out of 10 in terms of readiness for the French Open, what would you give him, Calvin?
He's so hard to judge, is Nadal, because his whole career he's had no sort of, there's not been any pattern with where he ought to be at in terms of slams. I say this all the time, like everyone else normally comes back and takes 6 months to get their match practice. He comes back and wins slams. He almost has a sort of athletics mindset in terms of peaking. But I've thought that before at the French, a couple of the French that he's not won. I thought, yeah, come the French, he'll be ready, and he just hasn't been. Last year was one. George?
Yeah, I do slightly fear he needs another week or two to get there. That said, he will probably stroll through the first 4 rounds of the French Open, and that might prove enough kind of match practice to kind of get him there on site. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how he gets on this week, basically, because I think this is the last real warm-up. He'll be pleased to see Alcaraz isn't playing, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure. Coming up next, we're going to talk about Ons Jabeur, scheduling, Barbara Krejcikova, and of course, Naomi Osaka. Now, we've talked loads about the ATP in Madrid. we haven't talked much about WTA, which frankly I think might be the way the organisers want it to go, but that is a debate we will get into. Let's talk about the good things that happened in the Madrid Open, on the women's side at least. Ons Jabeur, probably the biggest win of her career, coming through to take the title there. It was an impressive run. She beat Jessica Pegula in the final 7-5, love 6, 6-2. She also knocked out Simona Halep, who has been in good form, of course. She also beat Belinda Bencic, Jasmine Paolini, the semi-final against Yekaterina Alexandrova. I know we talk about WTA draws falling apart a bit, and this one did to a certain extent because there were top seeds going out left, right and centre, including, of course, Iga Świątek, who went out before the tournament even started. George, let's talk about the positives. Ons Jabeur, a player we think has a lot of talent on clay especially, and she's gone and won the title, which is a good result for the sport, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think, we were talking about Alcaraz's ability with a drop shot earlier. Ons is certainly up there for number one in the women's game for that shot. She's a really interesting player to watch. She's got a lot of character. The final was not the best match I've ever seen, to be honest. The second set was particularly just very weird. Like, it felt like Pegula was about to fall apart at the start, and then Jabeur's head just went walkies, and she was terrible and just got bageled. And it wasn't like that high on quality a lot of the time. But broadly speaking, yeah, I mean, she's played really, really well. It's another big title. It's another big step forward. And, we're talking about Carlos Alcaraz mopping up 59 slams in the... What number do we set on? 45, 44?
44 we got down to, I think.
44. The only player who's in the women's game who looks like they're going to be mopping up a significant number at the minute is Świątek. So there's going to be chances for Jabeur, both on clay and potentially at Wimbledon. She's got the sort of game that she can cause problems there, and she's beaten big players like Muguruza there last year. So I think her confidence is building. Wouldn't surprise me if she has a big run at both those slams.
Yeah, she played what should have been one of the... Well, I just remember thinking that quarter-final against Aryna Sabalenka was going to be like one of the great matchups. Big serving, big hitting Sabalenka against canny defensive Jabeur, and Sabalenka served brilliantly and just blew her away. But she did beat Iga Świątek in a really, really good match in the fourth round. So she clearly got some ability on grass. Calvin, she's got quite an all-round game, I suppose, which isn't she quite unusual in the women's game at the moment? And she is quite skillful, and she's a little bit underpowered, isn't she?
Yeah, I was just about to use that word, underpowered. She's a very, very good tennis player. Thinks her way through points. I think she's quite similar to a British girl who we're going to talk about later in that regard. But yeah, I think, she's great to watch. Plays a lot of slices, a lot of angles, changes things up. It's still to be seen whether she can do that at the latter end of the majors and get through some of the better players. But in the women's game, I'm sure she can. I'd even go as far as say I don't think there's any question there's worse players than Ons Jabeur that have won slams in the women's game in the last few years.
I suppose the problem is, as you say, she's never been past the quarterfinal of a Grand Slam. She's only played 2 quarterfinals. As I say, she got blown away by Sabalenka in 2021, and in 2020 she got blown away by Sofia Kenin, who was just on one. And we know now that was a real outlier in terms of Sofia Kenin. But I know there's more there. George,
I'd say that the good thing on that point though is that 3 years ago, you'd look at Ons Jabeur and would say, yeah, she's all right. She's got an interesting game, but she's not going to amount to anything. Whereas actually, I think the last 2 years, that kind of incremental build towards becoming a serious top 10 WTA players happened. And I think that's kind of come down to a lot of belief. So, she'd reached a quarterfinal in 2014 or something and always had that promise and not delivered. I'd be a bit more worried rather than someone who, it seems to me, I think she'd only been to the third round in 2019 or something. She's now taken a step forward, done a few fourth rounds, a couple of quarterfinals. there's no reason she can't take the next step in the backdrop of women's tennis at the minute and the way she's kind of moving up herself. So it's an interesting year for her. She missed the Australian Open, I think. So we don't really know where she's at, but she's played really, really well this week. And yeah, I think she's definitely someone to watch at the French and beyond.
It's worth noting as well that she's 27 years old, so we think of her as someone who's been around a long time, but at the elite level, she hasn't really. I think she didn't win a Grand Slam match until 2017, when she would have been 22 already. So she is something of a late bloomer. This is obviously the biggest title of her career. I think actually it's only her second career WTA title. So it is a massive deal. And, people do mature at different rates. She finished in the top 10 for the first time last year. That's something that takes a bit of getting used to. It takes getting used to turning up to tournaments and, even at 500s or 250s, your name's on a poster, and that's a bit different. So I do think there is an adjustment period that maybe takes a bit of time, and people do progress at different rates. So maybe it'll be interesting to see what happens when she comes into slams this year. I think she's up to world number... She'll go up to 6 next week, almost certainly, because Pliskova-Bot's going to lose a whole load of points. So she will be highly seeded. She'll get a good draw. There's a chance, depending on how Rome goes this week, there's a chance she'll be a top 4 seed in Roland Garros, because I don't think Barbara Krejcikova is going to play. So that gives her a real opportunity to get deep into a draw without having to... hit the banana skins early on. So I'm kind of intrigued. I also want to ask you, Calvin. She's obviously, she's Tunisian. She's the first Arab woman to do so many things. Just about all her greatest achievements. She's the first Arab woman to do that. So in this case, the first one to win a WTA 1000 title. You've obviously gone and coached a lot of tennis in places like Egypt and Tunisia as well, and in North Africa. I mean, how important is it to have role models there? There's clearly appetite for the game, because otherwise no one would be putting these tournaments on, right?
Yeah, there's tournaments every week pretty much in definitely in Egypt, and most weeks in Tunisia, I'd say. I don't know where these tournaments are held. They're held in hotels, and usually in Egypt they're usually in Sham, with the odd one in Cairo.
Yeah.
And in Tunisia, they're in a place called Monastir, which is about 3 hours south of Tunis, which is the capital. So where I'm getting at is that they're held in hotels. The tournament's played at a hotel, and you stay in a hotel. I don't know how much that is crossing over into tennis in the country, so I couldn't comment on that. You're usually quite enclosed. You wouldn't even know you were in Tunisia or Egypt unless you left the hotel, and you've no real need to ever leave the hotel. So I don't know how much crossover there is.
Yeah, I guess it's a sort of lack of tennis culture, isn't it? Like you want these tournaments to be really part of the tennis culture in a country, but if they're just put on as commercial endeavours, then they're not, I guess.
I'll say in Tunisia, when I've been there, there's a lot of tennis going on, even when the tournament's not going on. The tournament will finish, then there's a lot of kids coming to get coaching and groups and that kind of thing. So I assume that tennis is definitely growing in Tunisia. It seems, especially in Monastir, where those tournaments are. In Egypt, I've not been there for a few years, but less so. But the hotel where the tournament's at is quite a nice hotel, and I'm not sure how many of the locals they allow in to play.
George?
Yeah, I mean that, just to kind of build on that, it's always that culture and infrastructure that's kind of the bigger point in terms of how ready a country is to kind of produce top players, and that's almost why, even someone like Sisyphus, where that culture's not been there for a long time, is almost more of a surprise, and then you're interested in how that develops within that country and what that can kind of promote. We take a lot of hits at people like the LTA sometimes for not delivering top British players, but that's because they've got kind of every opportunity in front of them and every set of facilities you could probably need, apart from enough good clay courts, as Calvin will tell you. But these countries don't necessarily, and outside this kind of hotel tournament culture, as you say, it's about kind of getting that crossover and ensuring the other side happens on top of kind of hosting top players there and kind of inspiring the next generation, if you like.
There's talk that we may be having one of those type of tournaments in the UK in the next few years, because the LTA have recently taken over ownership of Nottingham Tennis Centre, and the plan is to build a hotel on the site and hold tournaments there most weeks. So we'll see if that plays a part. What I was going to say is, I mean, in Tunisia, obviously, you're getting such as Ons Jabeur coming through. I don't know what it's like below her. In Egypt, though, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of local players, unlike, I guess, Italy, where we're putting all their recent success down to the fact they've got loads of tournaments there.
Tunisia, incidentally, have one other woman in the top 1,000. Apologies for mispronouncing Shiraz Betri, who's 747 in the world. Can anyone name the Tunisian number one male player?
Is it Skander Mansouri?
It's not. It's Malik Jaziri.
Jaziri, I was going to say,
Skander Mansouri is the Tunisian number 2, and in fairness, he's only 5 places behind Jaziri because he's had a good run in. He won a tournament in Monastir last week, so he is fast approaching. Malik Jaziri, by the way, is 38, so maybe isn't the future of Tunisian tennis.
I was going to say, my question was going to be whether he was still playing or not, because I wasn't sure if he'd retired.
He's still ranked, I'll tell you that much.
Still ranked. Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, the other issue, I suppose, for countries like Tunisia as compared to like Italy is the kind of stature of the tournaments they can bring. I mean, Italy, obviously, we're talking about going to Rome next week. They've had a Masters event for a long time. They've been able to pull in kind of next-gen finals in Turin. They're going to have the ATP finals. Next-gen finals in Milan, ATP finals in Turin. So, you know, there's definitely an advantage for a lot of these European countries. There's not that many massive events in kind of North Africa and even South America, I guess. Which makes it maybe harder in terms of like inspiring that next generation. Like, oh, look, Roger Federer is coming to play here, or Nadal's coming to play in Rio, or wherever.
And I think as well, on top of that, George, that in Italy, they spread the tournaments round. There's one most weeks, but they're in different places around Italy. Whereas in Egypt, they're in Sharm el Sheikh in the hotel every week, and in Tunisia, they're in Monastir.
Food for thought. Let's move on, because one of the main talking points about the women's tournament this week was when it all took place. It was somewhat controversial, to say the least. George, just tell us a bit about why and how this was controversial.
Well, which strand was the most controversial, I suppose? The one that probably piqued the most outrage was the women's final being late, I would say. And this is a general problem. I mean, my personal feeling is have the women's and the men's finals of these sort of like Masters events on the same day, because you're always going to need to play the men's semis the day before, and they're notoriously difficult beasts to manage. You just never know how long those things are going to last. And actually, like a women's final at say like 1:00 in the afternoon and a men's final at 5:00.
Yeah,
it's quite unlikely to cross over on the same day, and makes it a pretty attractive kind of final ticket in Madrid. So I always think, first and foremost, that just makes the most sense to me scheduling wise, and also kind of gives the same level of prominence. Like, yeah, both these, you know, both men and women should end the tournament on the same day. You shouldn't just finish when the men finish the tournament, whatever. The other side of it was, I guess, to accompany the women's final being on Saturday, and the fact that this is one of these weird 10-day tournaments that I hate, because they just like kind of mess up the usual structure. Like, be a 2-week or a 1-week tournament. Don't muck around with this in between nonsense. From rankings perspectives, etc., it's just a nightmare. But yeah, because of this kind of 10-day hybrid, they've kind of pulled everything back. So you have a few days of women's only matches for the first 3 days, and then it kind of comes, and then you're having like long waits between matches after, like, they play the semi-finals on Thursdays, and then no women involvement. When I always think, again, in kind of these mixed events, it's nicer if you've got tickets for men's and women's events every day. I don't really see why the women's one should start out in the sticks 3 days early, why it couldn't just all be mixed in together, etc. But yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, I just hate the 10-day tournament, and I think that leads to most of the issues, frankly.
Yeah, I couldn't really understand. I mean, quite apart from the mess that was the women's final, the idea that at least 2 of the women's semi-finalists had been chosen before Stefanos Tsitsipas hit a ball, which it was insanely cramped. Like, the men had to play their whole tournament in about 4 days, And the women had this bizarre kind of lots of matches in the first week and then crammed in the first half of the second week, and then, as you say, kind of no matches whatsoever. So it was just lopsided at best. Like, irrespective of whether you think it's sexist or whatever, it was illogical.
Yeah, and they've still got guys playing matches about 2 a.m. So it's not like they're scheduling their 10 days particularly well.
Like Madrid in particular, of all the Spanish places I've visited, Madrid is particularly late night, but especially in the summer when it's stupid hot. Things do happen late at night, but you can't do that and then have the final at like a normal time the next day. Like, if you're going to have someone playing at 2 a.m, you're going to have to let them play at 2 a.m the next day. Calvin, I know you saw some logic to it.
It's not logic, and I guess I've changed my mind on it a bit since we spoke in the WhatsApp group.
Yeah, it should be noted we had a really quite heated discussion, which I think for context was in the aftermath of a 4-0 defeat for Manchester United as well, which kind of coloured things a little.
I mean, what I would say, totally what you're saying there, James, I have no idea, especially in Madrid, why they insist on the afternoon final for the men's. It would just make more sense to have it at evening anyway. The 2 men's semis and women's final on the Saturday thing, no one's ever found a solution to it. The US Open was trying it the same way as what they did it in Spain the other day. They did it for, they used to be called Super Saturday, it used to be men's semi, but that was 5 sets though. Men's semi 5 sets, women's final, and another men's semi after that. Then they changed it to the women's final goes on last, and I think now they've done away with that altogether. Men's semis are on the Friday, I think. Yeah. But I think now I do think the men's and women's final should both be on Sunday, although then you're always going to have the problem, if you're in a final, you should know when you're starting. I do think that, and you don't. So maybe the women's final should be the first match on the Saturday, but then again, to play the men's semis on Friday, if
you're going to have a 10-day tournament, why have you ended up with this concertina at the end of it? That's exactly right. It makes no sense to me. Look, the tournament is under new ownership. It has for a long time been owned by Jon Tiriac. I believe I've mispronounced his name suitably, which is fine because I'm not a big fan of his. It's been taken over by IMG, which means that there might be some quite rogue wildcards, but at least it might be run like a proper professional tennis tournament rather than some kind of... I mean, frankly, just ticket selling obsession. I understand that tournaments need to sell tickets, that's how the world works. But also, if you're going to agree to host the ATP and WTA event, you need to give them due prominence. That is the deal. If you don't want to have the women's event, fine, sack it off. But don't just minimise it. Don't have it as a sort of backup event in case all of your men pull out and you need some women to pad out the schedule.
I don't know whether... I expect it was probably set in stone anyway, but do we think it would have been any different if Paula Badosa would have been in the final?
It's a good question. I guess not. Because I seem to remember doing some planning around this event a while ago, and the schedule was published. They have the day schedule, and I seem to remember that coming out. I mean, hell, that can change. It always does. It's tennis. Nothing is set in stone.
I don't mean in terms of when they play, what day they play each match. I wonder whether the final they would have sort of asked her when she wanted to play.
No, I see. Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, as always, the people involved tend to make a massive difference.
But also, again, we come back to this, and it's one of the things I don't really get about Wimbledon, why they start the matches so late on the centre court. If you're going to have 3 matches towards the end of the tournament, you're going to have to suspect that at best, at least 2 of them are going to be long. So you're setting that last match is just going to go on too late if you're going to start it at the tennis at the time that they started it. But again, the Spanish won't do anything until about 4:00 in the afternoon, won't they? So.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of competing priorities. I mean, remember Wimbledon last year with Raducanu inexplicably being put on as the last match or third match on court 1. The day she lost to Tom Lanovich.
Yeah.
And you had Zverev and Auger-Aliassime play for about what felt like 100 hours before that match. And, whoever went through was then going to have their opponents having finished at about 1:00 in the afternoon while they were not even starting until about 8:30. There's all sorts of reasons why these things get moved around and tinkered, and they're typically following the money and not for kind of sane scheduling reasons. But yeah, they should do better, basically.
Let's move on. I don't know how much more there is to say about that. A couple of quick bits of injury news. Barbora Krejcikova is out of Rome. She hasn't played since February. She's, of course, the defending French Open champion. She's also the world number three, because she's been overtaken.
Like Badoza went past her,
she is. Yeah, exactly. I just couldn't remember, and I didn't have I was too busy looking at who the world number 747 was to look at the other end of the world rankings. She says she's had pain in her arm on and off since Doha, obviously the last tournament she played. Maybe not a huge surprise given how much tennis she played last year. Obviously she played singles and doubles pretty much full schedule, but we hope to see her back. I don't think it's very likely that she'll play the French Open now, which is a real shame. There's also some news from Naomi Osaka. She pulled out of Rome with what I've variously seen reported as an Achilles or an ankle injury, but the Achilles is what she said it was in Madrid, so I think we assume that it's that. Again, I don't know whether she'll play Roland Garros. A bit more likely than Krejcikova, but fingers crossed because she obviously is a massive star. I don't know how much more there is to say about those two, so I'm going to move on. A few Brits playing over in Madrid, of course. Generally a good week for Andy Murray, who's maybe the one we should focus on the most. He beat Dominic Thiem. He played very well. He beat Denis Shapovalov. He played less well, but Shapovalov is a much better opponent and is starting to find form again, as anyone who watched him scream his way through a match with Lorenzo Sonego today will tell you. Georgia, how are you feeling about Murray's prospects?
Pretty encouraged, I suppose. I mean, it's frustrating. Again, he's kind of had an illness.
Food poisoning, I'm told.
Yeah, something that's just nothing to do with his actual fitness, kind of pulling him out of a tournament again. Obviously, he pulled out of Rome as well. I don't know if that's purely because of the food issue, or whether he had to go through qualifying as well might have played a bit of a factor in that he didn't get a wild card in the end.
So I think he would have got a wild card. But he basically he didn't feel well enough to play qualies, and I think probably discretion the better part of valour.
Fair enough.
Which, he got a decent amount of match practice. He's probably going to go... I mean, I think we can expect to see him at Surbiton in the second week of the French, so I think he'll go off now and find a grass court.
Yeah, and I think you'd be pretty encouraged with what you saw from Madrid to think, okay, Murray can compete on the grass this year, and if he gets enough matches under his belt, manages his schedule well enough, gets himself physically peaking at Wimbledon, or peaking, whatever physically peaking for Murray is these days. I'm still not quite sure we know exactly what that is. He's good enough to cause problems there. And yeah, we've said it time and time again, but he's putting all his effort into Wimbledon. He's got Lendl back in. He's really kind of believing this is going to be his big make or break tournament, all eggs in one basket. It's really important when we do get there that he starts winning matches pretty quickly and easily and not fanning around in big five-setters. But we'll talk about that more when we get closer to the time. But yeah, encouraging start, I would say. Yeah,
gutted for him. He was obviously due to play Novak Djokovic for the first time in 5 years before he had to pull out on the morning of the match. Cam Norrie ran into Carlos Alcaraz. I don't think we can maybe read too much into losing to him because many better players did it, and probably would say that anyone can lose to him at the moment. Dan Evans and Jack Draper both lost to Andrei Rublev, but Jack Draper picking up a really good and routine win against Lorenzo Sonego and getting very, very close to beating Andrei Rublev, Calvin. I mean, you could say he should have won that match.
I didn't see the match because I was working myself. I was following the live score, but it was certainly very, very close. I think he was a break up in the third, wasn't he? I'm pretty sure he was. Yeah, good week for Jack. Good week for Dan Evans as well, I think. Got a couple of wins. So
shame he's then lost in first round to Nicolas Basilashvili in Rome.
Has he? Right.
Yeah, which isn't a great result on paper. And having watched bits and pieces of it, if I tell you it was 7-6, 6-2, can you guess what happened?
Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Dan Evans is still Dan Evans at the heart of it. George, you did watch Jack Draper.
I did watch Draper as part of my bed-long week. I thought he played really, really well, and actually, he definitely should have won, really. I think you'll take it as kind of good experience against a good player. Rublev sort of hung around, but the first set was so ridiculously dominating from Jack. It was fantastic. It was another kind of sign of the sorts of levels he can reach against kind of top-level opposition. I just quickly wanted to remark on Rublev, who obviously played a few British guys this week. The guy's mad, isn't he? I mean, he
completely.
literally... It's kind of scary. I hope he calms down a bit. I'm really worried for his hands. He just punches strings every other week or something. It's mental.
I mean, we sort of joke about it, but it is genuinely a problem for Andrei Rublev. He's very clearly completely obsessed with tennis and has very little interest or ability to engage with anything else. And actually, he has kind of alluded to it a bit in some of the things that he said, that it becomes very difficult for him to switch off. And when he has bad days, it really, really bothers him, and he can't really console himself. So it's pretty troubling when someone starts to talk about that. And I mean, we talk about Dan Evans having anger issues on the court. Andrei Rublev, as you say, is in a similar ballpark, I would suggest.
He's always been the same as well, right since juniors. And that's the weird thing with him. He's always kind of looked the same. His hair's kind of always been quite long. His clothes seem to have always fit him the same. His shots look exactly the same. And he's always been a bit mad.
Well, we need those people on tour. I'll take it. As long as he doesn't start smashing his racket into umpires, then I'm all right with it. There is a line, it turns out.
I may be glossing over lots of other things, but he's very self-harm anger on the court rather than kind of directing at other people, as far as I can see.
That in terms of rackets and stuff. I can't remember him smashing any ball boys, but
it's the punch of the strings, which I always am just that's crazy. That must hurt so much. I mean, he's always bleeding on the knuckles, but just lob your racket, man. Just take the code violation.
A player I coached used to do that, or still does do it, even though I don't coach him anymore. So it wasn't me; it was Chad causing that. But you'd look at his hands. Seriously, sometimes he'd come into training and it'd just strike you on his hands with just scabs all over the knuckles and grazes. And he'd often regularly in matches, I'd see him, he'd have to go and get a towel and the towel would just be covered in blood.
Crikey. I mean, it's not good for you, is it? Andrei Rublev, get some help.
Fonini's another one I've seen do it before, I think. I'm trying to think
who
else of the string punches.
On the anger thing, because I've been at work at Nottingham today, I had a discussion with a couple of the players, because on one of the courts, one of the male players absolutely decimated a racket. So he basically, I'd have to give you the context of the match. He was a set up, and he'd been 2 breaks up, and then lost both breaks, but was still 5-4 with the other guy serving. So when he lost the second break, he completely decimated a racket. And then he ended up breaking again to win the match. And we were sort of saying, in that situation, I was asking the lads, in that situation, having won the match, do you think, no need to break the racket because I was going to win anyway? Or do you think that the getting the release of energy, smashing the racket, helped him win the match? If that makes sense. So do you take the racket as helping you win the match, or do you think I've just cost myself 140 quid there for a racket that I didn't need to?
I mean, the reactions from all players are kind of astonishing, but I think the one that kind of sticks out for me in terms of he's really angry, but it's the most controlled possible anger is Wawrinka when he snaps it over his knee. I mean, he's clearly so furious in that moment, but still has the calmness for I'm just going to decimate this thing over my knee in the kind of the safest way, both for me and not to hurt anyone else.
But that racket that Wawrinka plays with is rock solid. It's made of graphite. when he did that, I play with Yonex rackets myself, and I've felt that racket. It is made of solid graphite. And when he did that, I can't believe he didn't do damage to himself.
He's done it a few times. It's a common thing. It's something he must have perfected over the years.
Seems like a good moment to segue into our regular segment, which is Calvin's Minute of Tennis. We thought this week it might be interesting to talk about weights of rackets. Of a few things being said about Dominic Thiem and Alexander Zverev. George?
Yeah, and frame rigidity or flexibility. I think that's the thing they were talking about with Team. It's like he said he got a very stiff frame.
If you're listening and you don't know what all this means, fear not, because Calvin, in the next 60 seconds, timed by George, who I hope is sober enough to do so, is going to explain exactly what is meant by rigidity, frame tensions, frame weights, all sorts of things. Calvin, tell us about racket weights and tensions.
Generally, the professional players will play with heavier rackets than social rackets. So nowadays, the racket manufacturers will make a pro heavy racket and the same racket, but a lighter version, which is generally about 300 grams as the cutoff point. Rigidity just it's as it sounds, and there is no sort of pattern to what type of player would play with a particular stiff frame or a more flexible frame. It means just as it says. So when the ball strikes the racket, a more flexible frame will bend. You can feel it bend, and another one will feel basically like a piece of wood in your hand. And it just depends on how you want the racket to feel on connection. It's the same thing as what some players use vibration stoppers and some players don't.
Now, anyone who knows Calvin's minute of tennis is that it's almost never a minute, and we've almost always got follow-up questions. George, do you feel sated, or do you need to know more?
I do need to know more. So earlier I was watching Team play against Fognini, and he was playing pretty well. And Mark Pecci, who's an excellent analyst and coach, and often brings like a really good technical angle to his commentary, was talking about, and he said a bit annoyingly, because I didn't see the whole match, I saw kind of the second set, but he said he'd been talking about earlier about why he felt Team might feel the need to move away from a more kind of rigid frame at this stage in his career as he continues this comeback. What would be the reason he'd be thinking about that? Why would a player want to move away from that sort of frame to not?
I honestly don't know, because I've always found it's just in what players, how they want the racket to feel, if you will. And so I don't really know why Petch said that. I know he's quite big on, he takes a lot of credit for changing Raducanu's racket, or I can't remember whether it's changing it or talking her into not changing racket. And he thinks that was a big difference in her career. I don't know whether it was. I don't know what she changed to and from. No, that was it. She was going to change racket from Wilson, and he talked her out of changing it.
Have you ever seen a player like for whom changing racket or changing weight of racket has made almost an overnight difference, and it has completely changed their game? The
biggest one was Djokovic. Djokovic used to play with a Wilson blade, which is probably the most standard of all the racket. The head radical and the Wilson blade are, I think they're the two best rackets, all things considered. They're both no gimmicks. They're straight, mid flex.
How's your sponsorship deal with Yonex working out here, Calvin?
Good question. So Djokovic played with the Wilson blade when he won his first slam in Australia. He then changed his sponsorship. Head sponsored him and created a new racket for him, which was the Head Speed. And he really struggled with it at the start. It was quite a different racket as well. It was normally when players change racket companies, which they occasionally do, they'll just reproduce the old racket in one way or another. But they didn't. They created a whole new racket for him, and he couldn't get used to it for about 2 years. And then word is that he ended up playing with an old Head Radical and had it painted up like a Speed, which I think was one of George's next questions.
That was going to be one of my next questions, is how many pros do you know are just playing with completely different rackets that they've kind of painted over?
It's not quite that simple, because the pros they all have their rackets customized anyway. So when you get a racket off the shelf, it's 310 grams or whatever, and the head balance and the handle balance, the grip balance is different. Pros will always mess around with it. They'll have a bit of extra weight put on here and a bit of extra weight put on there. I know one of the lads who I coach, has just started playing with new Dunlop rackets, and he's added a load of weight. It's a hugely heavy racket. He's even had a racket engineer shave a couple of millimeters off the bottom of the racket as well, because he wanted a slightly shorter racket.
I mean, this is all basically Greek to me, but I do feel more informed now, Calvin. Thanks.
I think just on the weight of the racket, which the reason why you would have a heavier racket is if you want more. Basically, you want more weight behind it, and that's why the pros play with heavier rackets, because the ball's coming through harder. So you don't want something flimsy and light in your hand. You want something, when you're hitting it, it's got a bit of weight behind it to deflect the ball.
Thank you very much. As I say, I feel much more knowledgeable. I hope you do at home. If you've got any questions or follow-up questions on rackets, or you want Calvin to work out George, what racket do you want from Calvin? What's he gonna? Do you want a recommendation?
Well, Calvin did sort of recommend trying Yonex to me. Yeah. And I do play with Yonex now. And actually, I did try a few of these in rackets. And, as weird as the rigidity sounds, like I really didn't get on with like the Wilson, for example, because that just felt too hard to me. The one I tried, I can't remember which one it was now. But it is interesting, I think. And I was just going to say, if you are listening and you have any suggestions for these, just a minute, because I am basically pulling them out my arse at about 10 minutes before we do the show every week. So
really pull back the curtain on how prepared we are there, George. That's great.
I know Calvin can bring insight into anything, but if there are things you want to know about, we have this font of knowledge. Please do help us tap into it.
Either so the best ways to get in touch are either let us know on Twitter @LoveTennisPod, or you can email us lovetennispod@gmail.com. You can also just leave a 5-star rating and a review, and then just knock your request on the bottom of that, and then I will definitely read it. As you know,
that's the best one.
Yeah. Incidentally, we have had an email this week from Kathleen Murray over in Orlando, Florida, which is a lovely part of the world, of course. She says, I absolutely love tennis. I enjoy all three of you, and it's going to pay me to say this, but I really enjoy George's take and introspection on things. Calvin's tell it like it is stance from a coaching standpoint is mildly amusing and always insightful, damned with faint praise. And of course, the way James holds it all together reminds me of a conductor keeping the orchestra on pace and in tune, which I think I might have to get framed. In closing, I wait for every episode and was very sorry to hear that George wasn't feeling up to par, but due to some great meds, doesn't feel that he's not feeling well. I wish him a speedy recovery. Keep up the great, informative, entertaining work. From Orlando, Florida, a loyal listener, Kathleen. Well, thank you very much, Kathleen, for your email. We really appreciate it. After the break, we're going to very quickly, in part 3, talk about one more British player. Sonay Kartal is on fire. If you read the British media, you'll be very familiar with the phrase, the next Emma Raducanu. Unfortunately, this is how the world works. We can't just have success and enjoy it. We're constantly looking for the next hit of sweet, sweet success. Well, fortunately, Sonay Kartal has had an absolutely brilliant year so far. She is now the British number 10. She's going to go up to 317 in the world after winning the title in Nottingham last week. Calvin, you obviously known Sonay for quite a long time. Tell us a bit more about her. When's the first time you remember seeing her on court, and what is it that's making her so successful this year?
I first saw her about 5 or 6 years ago, I think. She played a girl who trained at the same place as I coached her, and she was evidently a very talented player. Very small, had a lot of skills, really good hands, that kind of thing. She then had a lot of ups and downs with injuries. Every time I saw her play, she impressed me, but you'd then go 3 or 4 months without seeing her play. And she's managed to put together a bit of fitness, I think, in the last year. Started winning pro leagues, which were the excellent tournaments that were put on independently in Britain. I think made herself a bit of money on that, got herself some money to travel, went traveling to play tennis and won a lot when she was traveling, and now she's pretty much winning everything that gets played in Britain every week.
Yeah, she won 2 15Ks at the end of last year, one in Antalya, one in Monastir in Tunisia, which we were discussing earlier, and then she's won 3 25Ks so far this season, one in Birmingham, one in Glasgow, and now one in Nottingham. She didn't just win the one in Nottingham this week. She won 6-1, 6-love in the final. No one really got near her all week, apart from Jasmine Conway, who took a set off her in the first round in a tiebreak, but really that was about it. Calvin, this is obviously a level you know well, the 25Ks. How long does one spend continually winning 25Ks? You know, do you stick there for a year to kind of learn the trade, or are you not getting anything out of it at that point?
No, because your ranking, it won't help your ranking once it gets to a certain point. Your ranking points will be full of 25. So even if you keep winning them, it won't affect your ranking. So she can move up now, I would say. She's cruised through that. I watched her last week. I was at the tournament, obviously, and she was a level above everyone else. She was 3 levels above everyone else who was there.
What's the ceiling for Sonny, Calvin? What do you see for her going forward?
It's difficult to say. I don't spend, although I have coached girls before, I've not spent as much time in the female game at that level. So I don't know. She's not that tall, Sonay. I wouldn't say she's underpowered at this level, but I don't know how that would translate to the top 100, if that makes sense. The rest of her game is 100% would be more than comfortable in the top 100. It's then whether she has enough power, whether she has enough power, or B, whether she can negate other players' power.
What does her summer look like then? Because obviously she has the advantage of being British. She'll get a few wildcards. She'll obviously play some of the warm-up tournaments. But what's the entry level for her in terms of, say, Wimbledon? Will she get a wildcard into qualies? Is she in the running for a wildcard to the main draw?
I would 100% be giving her a wildcard into main draw. She's very exciting. She won't look out of place there, even if she doesn't win, or if you drop her into a women's main tour event now, she wouldn't look out of place. She will be competitive. So there's no reason. They've not got anybody better than her to give wildcards to. I don't want to name names because I get myself into trouble like this, but all the usual suspects who they keep on giving wildcards to every year, and they might win the odd match at Wimbledon, but it's not doing anything for their career or anything like that. She'd be the first name on the list for a wildcard for me.
Are we to expect her to be a good grass court player? Has she grown up on that a lot? What do you know much about her grass game?
I don't think many British players. It always cracks me up when people say British players grow up on grass. Like, have you seen the weather in Britain? I mean, the season only lasts about 4 weeks anyway. And have you been in Britain in the summer? Like, no one grows up on it. We play on it 5% more than any other country. But I don't see any reason why she wouldn't. She moves great. She's got a wonderful slice backhand, and she can generate power. She's not underpowered by any stretch. I don't know where it translates to the next level up, but I see no reason why she shouldn't be competitive on the grass. They should be giving her main draws. They should be giving main draw wildcards into all of the women's event this summer.
And final one from me, if you were going to compare her with someone on the main tour, men's or women's, who's the player you think she's most like?
I said to James the other day that I think she's like a female version of Dan Evans. And she's very like Ons Jabeur. Like I said earlier, she plays a lot like that.
Interesting. Well, you heard it here first. Sonay Kartal, the next Ons Jabeur. We'd be delighted if she goes that high. It would be brilliant for British tennis to have 2 women right up there in the top 10. Very finally, a couple of retirements to report. Kevin Anderson has announced his retirement. I saw a picture of him the day after he retired from tennis, out on court warming up for an exhibition, which I thought, if I had been a professional sports player for best part of 18 years, 15 years, for the first week after I retired, you probably wouldn't see me before 10 o'clock in the morning very often. But that's just the kind of guy Kev is. Calvin, a good example, a 2-time Grand Slam finalist, for a guy who obviously had a massive serve, and with the greatest respect, and I don't mean this as an insult, not a huge amount else. Like, he wasn't the best player in the world, but, he got up into the top 10, he made $17 million. The best maybe he could have got out of his talent?
I'd say so, yeah, and I think even more important than that, you won't find anyone in tennis who's got a bad word to say about Kevin Anderson.
Yeah.
He was genuinely a good bloke. I've never met him, but everyone I know who spent time around him, they will all say that he's a great bloke, and I think that means much more than anything he did in tennis. But yeah, very, very good player as well.
George, I don't think you'd say anything against that.
No, I definitely wouldn't. And I was kind of again in my kind of fugue state this week, reminiscing to kind of what I call the good old days of the pods, where it was just me and you, James. And I think we used to call
the much better old days.
the reviews might disagree, but it was. I think we used to call this the Kevin Anderson Appreciation Podcast.
Yeah, very
kind of
much
early
so.
episodes, because we used to have such a lot of time for him. So he's always had a bit of a love affair with the podcast, I think,
which is silly
he's
because
not been involved.
I do also think that players like him should be banned. And the year that he got to the final of Wimbledon was one of the toughest years for me personally to watch, because I don't really want to talk too much about the matches that he played, but I didn't enjoy them, put it that way, and I wasn't always in the best state to enjoy them either. There's also some news from Gilles Simon that he, having pretty much hated tennis for the last year, as far as I can tell, is going to be retiring at the end of the year. Calvin, he is someone you know quite well, as far as I know.
Yeah, it always amazes me that he's still playing, and that his rank's still so high, because he loses first round every time I see him. But, yeah, he was a good player. He was a good player at his prime. I think he was probably the fastest player in the world around a court. Smooth the ball around. Classic French. You don't get that type of player coming from any other country other than French. He could only have been French. Sort of smoothing the ball round, nice touch, painting pictures on the court, that kind of thing. A bit temperamental as well.
To say the least.
Yeah.
Go on, George.
Unconfirmed stat, but got to be the only person who's ever drawn 100 enforced errors out of Novak Djokovic, hasn't he? That's something to take with you from your career.
I don't know if that's going to be his opener on the after dinner tour. I mean, I don't imagine he's going to do a lot of after dinner speaking, but I can't imagine that.
Well, he seems to slag a lot of people off quite often, doesn't he?
He's not afraid to speak his mind, put it that way.
Blames French tennis's decline on Roger Federer, so that might get him a few bookings through there. That's quite interesting, if nothing else.
Quite possibly. Made it as high as world number 6. 2 Grand Slam quarterfinals to his name, Australia in 2009 and then Wimbledon in 2015. So I think probably 2 players who we would think reached the heights that they could have done and probably couldn't have gone a huge amount further. But that's all you can really do, is get the most out of your talent. We try and get the most out of our talent. We try to get the most out of the time. We've probably had too much of it this week, but thank you very much for listening as always. Please do leave us a rating and a 5-star review, because we really appreciate it. Drop us an email, drop us a text if you've got our numbers. We're quite lonely quite a lot of the time. And most importantly, come back and listen next week.
Sports Social Podcast Network.